let's first explain why you began all those years ago when reporting on the Watergate break-in to use what was then a fairly unconventional technique, which was these confidential sources, sometimes called anonymous sources.
Well, they're not anonymous to us. Also, I mean, that's very important to understand. The reason Carl Bernstein and I used those confidential sources, it's the only way you could get people to tell you the truth. They were not going to go out, and if you said, gee, this is on the record, you're going to get the press release version, the official version. Of course, in Watergate, there were so many secrets that were buried and hidden. So how are you going to do that? You have to find people who will be truth tellers where you can establish, and this is the key, a relationship of trust where you're going to protect them. You are going to check out the information from other sources. And so you present a version that is authentic and real rather than something that is manufactured. And in the case of the Nixon presidency, just peppered with lies and deceit.
And just to explain to people your process, because when I was at Newsweek, I was cautious about anonymous sources because, you know, you don't want to create the opportunity for something that can't be checked. If you say something happened at a meeting, and you have a quotation where, say, the president said something or the Secretary of Defense said something, how do you arrive at that quotation?
From somebody who's there. Lots of people keep diaries. They're extensive notes, and in many cases, documentations of this. You can find other people in the room and check it, and then go back to the original source. This is the joy of having time, so you can maybe work on one meeting or one event, and you've done a great number of interviews and checked it, and you get to a point where you have the best obtainable version of the truth.
And you have notes on all of this, which include the sources, which will eventually go into, I think it's Yale University, right, where somebody at some point will be able to figure out from your notes, from your documentation, who told you what.
Yes, and most specifically, I tape recorded these interviews with nearly everyone. I have thousands of pages of documents, hundreds of hours with people who were participants. And the agreement with the sources was, I'm not going to name you, but I'm going to use this information if I can verify it. And so I was able to do that. And you're exactly right. Somebody's going to be able to go back and do an archaeological dig, as they have done on Watergate. Carl Bernstein's and my papers are at the University of Texas, all the notes, all the data, all the story drafts, and people have gone and looked at that.
And it's fair to remind people that your most important source, Mark Felt, publicly denied that he had leaked anything to you.
Yes, and he was number 2 in the FBI, and he was quite clever about it because he said, I'm not Deep Throat, and of course, if I was Deep Throat, I would deny it. And so he was able to have it both ways for a long time until 33 years later, he came out and identified himself as that source.
When I read the book, what I'm struck by is the degree of chaos that you describe, all of which centers around a president who seems, somewhat impulsive to listen to the person who last talked to him. He pits his advisors against each other almost deliberately. How much of that is normal?
Pitting one advisor against another is absolutely acceptable. Lots of presidents do this. They want to have the debate. What happens in the Trump White House, and I think the book shows in chapter and verse, it's Trump against the facts. and the experts will come in. For instance, I mean, only you could probably write a long paper about the World Trade Organization. But Trump, in one session, says this is the worst organization in the world. We lose all of the fights. This is where we go and make complaints about unfair trade practices. And the experts, the aides come in and say, oh, 85.7% of the cases we win. And Trump says, no, that's wrong. And they say, call your trade representative. These are the facts. No, Trump is just, he closes down, will not listen. It is the absence of an open mind. I mean, you know so well that anybody in any business or institution, it's very important that they grow and learn and listen. The capacity to really listen is very important in a leadership decision-making role.
Stay with me. Next on GPS, Bob Woodward will tell us why Trump's senior-most officials describe something as the big problem with President Trump. What is it, and is there a solution? When we come back. And we are back with Bob Woodward, the author of the runaway bestseller, Fear. Bob, you describe Jim Mattis, among others, but Jim Mattis principally, as saying there is a big problem with Donald Trump. And it recurs through the book. Describe what Mattis and Gary Cohn see as the big problem with Donald Trump.
What is really important and has not been reported until this book, that there was an alliance between the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, and Gary Cohn, the chief economic advisor. And they had lunch in the Pentagon. They said, we've got to get the president in some environment, off-site, away from television, away from the chaos of the White House, and give him an education about this old world order. So they call him over to the tank, which is the meeting place of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What Mattis describes to the president is the great gift of the greatest generation to Americans, and that is this rules-based international order. You have trade, you have the security agreements like NATO, and you have the secret intelligence partnerships, and that's the old framework. You can't just ignore it and destroy it, and Trump wants to do that. And you see everyone fighting him on it, and at the end, Mattis is just depleted, feels totally frustrated. In the case of Secretary of State Tillerson at that point, this is when, as NBC reported accurately, he calls the president, said the president was an effing moron. This is the big problem, but it doesn't get solved.
So it is this sort of web of alliances, the trade deals, the NATO, the security relationships that undergirds the stability, creates the open world economy. And Trump, in the book, is constantly lashing out at it because he sees it, we're paying too much, why don't we bring the troops home? Is it your sense that when, for example, on South Korea, when people explain to him, well, if you brought the troops home, you'd still have to pay for them, and in fact, it would cost more because South Korea subsidizes the cost, unless you intend to disband those troops in South Korea. Is there any indication that he learns in office?
Well, that's part of the problem. But then he gets, see, this is at times driven by his anger. There is a missile interceptor system called THAAD. Costs $1 billion a year, but it's the best in the world. And no one has anything like it. And Trump asks about it, and they tell him, oh, it's a good deal because we have a 99-year lease. And Trump says, well, who pays for it? And they say, oh, we pay for it. And Trump goes, why are we doing this? Take the effing thing out, put it in Portland, Oregon. And this makes no military, strategic, or intelligence sense.
You point out in one very telling anecdote, which I assume you got from Steve Bannon, that Bannon tries to point out to him that he's going to have a problem running for the primary for the Republican nomination because he really has never voted in a primary. And he says, no, I voted for 30 years in every one. And Bannon says to him, no, you haven't. And he says, yes, I have. And then he says, it's a matter of public record. You've only voted once in 1988. And then he says, yeah, I guess that's right.
It's not only Steve Bannon, but it's Dave Bossie, who's another campaign aide. But he makes all sorts of sweeping declarations. They point out that he's given all this money to Democrats. He said, no, it's not true. And they say, oh, here the records are, and it proves it. Well, that's okay. I'll just power over that, essentially, which, of course, is the Trump style. And when you're president, in the end, I think that there are about 2 or 3 moments where you're making really critical decisions. What are we going to do with the financial crisis in 2008? What's the response going to be? What are we going to do about the 9/11 terrorist attack? And you go to process. Process really matters. I mean, it's almost funny, if it didn't make you cry, that General Kelly, when he comes in as chief of staff last year, he wants to write out certain rules. And one of the rules is you can't make decisions on the fly by the seat of your pants. And they say to the president, they write it out, if you're going to make a decision, we have to have a formal decision memo that you will sign. And seat of the pants decisions don't count. They're not considered final. And this is a management system and this is why I call it a nervous breakdown of the presidency.
Bob Woodward, always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
Sir.